Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about production access. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, why should developers not have access to a production database? Well, the usual argument is that you might make a mistake. If you run the wrong query, you might delete the whole thing or do something silly like that. Another one is that there might be private information in the database that you're not allowed to look at for compliance purposes and things like that. Usually I find though that the people who follow this rule too rigorously is the same sort of people that, well, they're idealists and usually more into concepts and things like that rather than being pragmatic about the thing. So one that a lot of I usually hear is that there should be no reason for any software developer to have production access ever. You should not directly access it. You should have checks and balances in place and systems and things like that that will help you to fix this so that you don't make a mistake. And I kind of go, yeah, I'm sure that that's perfectly fine if you are Google or Facebook or something like that, and you literally have billions to put into designing custom systems that makes this a feasible strategy. The reason why I argue that is because, as I like to say, it depends. It really depends. Nobody knows your system. And so creating a rule such as you should always do test-driven development, no exceptions because it's going to make your code quote unquote better, is, well, it might be a nice guideline to follow as a general rule of thumb, but if you don't understand why we are saying these things and why these rules make sense and under what circumstances those rules make no sense anymore, well, then you're going to, in my opinion at the very least, be worse off than if you actually understood these things. So if you fundamentally understand, I argue now, that the reason why most developers, or like as a rule we say, don't have production database access is because you might have a mistake. Well, then the clever among you might figure out that, well, it's probably the case that it doesn't really matter if I make a mistake or not. The thing is, we want to safeguard our production data. And so if you think about that a little bit, okay, so are there any other things that could happen that would destroy my production database? Well, I could, without having production access, ship some code that destroys the whole data. Like that basically deletes everything or overwrites it in a weird format or something weird like that. So now all of a sudden your golden rule about, oh, you shouldn't have production access is it's no longer the problem. Now the problem is don't do anything in your code that causes a production issue for your data, for example. So how are you going to protect yourself against that? Well, that's my argument basically. My argument is that the idea, yes, it is good to not have production access to your database, but not because that in of itself is like it's not a reason. It's just a norm to follow so that you don't make any mistakes. And I can give you suggestions which I argue for, which are more sane in my opinion, because I find that for a lot of companies, the time it takes to debug issues is enormously high if the developers don't have production access. It doesn't have to just be to the database, it can be production access to anything. Because if you only have the option of maneuvering within a test environment and things like that, you can never completely dismiss the fact that there is an environment difference between your production environment and your development environment. And that happens, I will go as far as to say, on a depending on the team. I've seen it on a weekly basis, where literally practically every week there is some issue reported in production that we can't really fix without having some other team or like a DevOps team or something like that who for some reason have production access, because I mean we normal mortal incompetent developers, we can't have that, but the DevOps team, they can, because they're more infallible, I suspect. They know how to press the buttons in a better way so that they don't make any mistakes. And so what I usually argue is that instead of having that rule, do this. Follow the same basic practice as the Amazon and like the cloud providers, Amazon, GCP, and so forth. So like all the best practices around owning your own infrastructure, which is don't use your root account for everything. Because if you want to debug something in production, yes, you might need to get access to the database, but maybe you don't have to have the option of changing anything. Maybe you can just have a read role where you can read everything and you can see everything and so forth, but you can't just drop the whole thing for no reason. That would be an idea. Another idea would be that, well, if you have a production database, then backups is probably a good idea, because if you make a mistake, it's critical or something like that, or for some reason, which I have been in situations as well, where someone wrote some code that created an inconsistent database state. How are you going to fix that? Because now half your records is in one state and work, and half of the records are in a broken state, which means that the application crashes. So now you have to change the data somehow. But you're not allowed to in production, right? Because there's some rules saying that that's bad, right? Well, in those sorts of situations, it might be good to again have a access level, like to have a backup that you can fall back to, if that is that's in my opinion last resort. Because even in a rollback situation, or like if you have a backup also that you have missed some records and this is a catastrophe scenario, so it would be even nicer if you could design a little script or something like that that rewrites it into the right format, for example. And that script should probably run on an account that does not have, again, the ability to drop everything or so forth, like these more very extreme destructive things that you can do. Maybe it should just be scoped to the thing that you actually intend to do. Those sorts of practices is, in my opinion, much more pragmatic, much more realistic, and they will be more useful to you than having this rule saying that you should never access production and so forth. Because as I said, that rule makes a lot of sense, because the intent is for you to not be like sort of risky, because it is very easy. I know how easy it is once you get used to working, guys. It might not feel like this right now, but I mean, guys, to me, I barely get a raised pulse anymore if I do something in production, because you get used to it, and that is the dangerous part. As you can imagine, like if you are a doctor or something like that, or a soldier or whatever, or a police officer for not enough time, all these things that seems to be sort of, ethical, or like for us like us non these things people, it might feel weird for to say to like a doctor just sort of treats brain surgery or like saving somebody's life as, yeah, it's just another day at the office. But when you get desensitized to things that might actually be risky and actually has a bit of impact, you become a bit of a risk to yourself and to the organization or the goals or whatever. And that is something you have to respect, because remember, even though you don't feel like this is a big deal, well, if you do make a mistake, and you are human, so you might make a mistake, you have to make sure that you minimize the chance of that happening. That is the goal. That is the idea that you should bring with you from this rule. But you can access production if you know how to make sure that you don't take unnecessary risk with the data. So what I want you to take away from this is that usually the reason why we say that developers shouldn't have production access is because you might make a mistake, or there might be legal reasons, for example, where you're not allowed to access some of the data and so forth. But as I like to say, guys, these sorts of general rules, treat them as guidelines, because they have a grain of truth to them and they have a good reason for being these sort of norms that we should follow. But just don't treat them as holy doctrine, where it's a fundamentalist type of deal, or where you just follow this rule for no reason. Always ask, why am I following this rule? What benefits does it bring, and what is it trying to help me understand? This rule, I argue, is here to help you understand that you have to make sure that you don't make a mistake and destroy the data, because if the data is gone, your system is gone. more or less. So make sure that you understand how to do backups, make sure that you take prudent caution with, make sure that if you're just going to debug something in production or you're going to do something like that, have a read-only role for that so that you can safely access the data without making a mistake that destroys the data. And if you really need to do something that actually changes the data, make sure you test out your scripts or your updates in like a non-production environment first, verify that it works, and then try to minimize risk by only allowing it to, like, your operations to do the thing that you really strictly need to do. Take these precautions every single time, because I promise you guys, after a few years of working, depending on who you are, you might not even feel anything when you're doing things that are quote-unquote high risk, and where like a junior would shit their pants if they had to do that, but you won't because you've done it so many times. In those sorts of situations, it's super easy to be a bit forgetful or a little bit wishy-washy and so forth. And in those situations, these rules, you should just follow them for the same reason as I said with a doctor or like a police or officer or something like that. Those rules are there to make sure that regardless of if you're really new on your job or you're really experienced, that you have a little bit of a safety, like a safety procedure to make sure that you don't make a mistake. That's basically what it comes down to. Have a great day.